you here, both in our extended audience and the work group itself. I've asked Thomas to prepare a few opening remarks for our work group for today. And at that time, we'll sort of open it up to any questions and reactions we have from the full work group based on the agenda that we put together.
Yep. So here and I put together, Ms. Orange Jones and I put together a list of topics to be discussed that are in no particular order. We'll kind of take them out of order actually, because this was just like top of mind. What are the things that we want to accomplish as a study work group today? We're going to talk about stakeholder engagement, timeline, and process today. That will be towards the end of the presentation. We're going to talk about student growth in detail and how the student growth formula works, some selected data, and some issues with it, and things that we want to look into. We're going to talk about the 3 through 8 model versus the high school model, and talk about adjustments that we can make there. And then we're going to talk about items between now, the end of this meeting, and April 1st, which is when we believe the next meeting will be, and get that on my list. So in a minute, I'll start going through a presentation. I'll ask if Ms. Orange Jones has anything to add.
Fantastic. Let's open it up to other members if there's questions about the areas of focus.
Great. So as we've carried on our conversations, I've tried to synthesize a couple things. And we think that there's going to be 2 slides here. One that's going to talk about what are we trying to accomplish in the accountability system. And then the second slide that comes after will be about what the purpose of school accountability is. After these 2 slides, we're going to have a discussion slide where you'll have these 2 things side by side that we can dig into and talk about. So what are we trying to accomplish in assessing our current accountability system? We want to strengthen the system's growth component so that real growth is incentivized and rewarded. We want to maintain our proficiency goals. Proficiency in this state is mastery. That high school accountability reflects college and career readiness standards and is aligned with the way that we measure our 3 through 8 schools. And we will ensure that our results are clear and easy to understand. Also in our conversations, I've heard a lot about what is the purpose of school accountability. So we tried to distill a few things here. One, we think that it's to improve student academic achievement. It should motivate adults in the building to focus on student academic growth and measurable outcomes. We want to provide a fair assessment of performance for the purposes of communication. So it should be easy for parents and educators to understand. It needs to communicate the right things. And lastly, it needs to, but certainly not least, it needs to allow us to prioritize resources, energy, and intervention on schools that need improvement. And now you'll see them side by side, and I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about how this looks, what we might consider adding, what's not covered here, what's completely off base.
I think that's, yeah, and I would venture to go almost question by question as it relates to what you just shared, Thomas. So the first is, as a study group, when you see either what we're trying to accomplish or the purpose, what resonates? What are you like, this makes sense, yes, like aligns with what I would have expected to see here. And then we'll go to the next topic, which is what are the things that are still outstanding or that you might actually have open questions about.
Yeah, so I'm not sure this is the right time to ask this question now, but one of the things that has always stood out to me, and I think it's the right appropriate time, is when we talk about what we want to accomplish in terms of the accountability system. I think one thing that we need to provide clarity on, there's been a lot of conversations about clarity, transparency. It should be a system that people understand. I mean, it shouldn't be a black box, so that teachers feel the impact of their work, it's being recognized, it's being appreciated, and so forth. And so the way it's done today, is that you have a scale with certain weights on certain parameters. But for me, we should be able to differentiate, we should be able to clearly define and differentiate the difference between an A and a B, the difference between a B and a C. And we should start by putting some framework around that. So number one, what does the law require? What does basic policy require for the accountability system as a whole? And then for each of those letter designations, we should have clear borders around each one. For example, Thomas, you ran 26 cases for me. I took those 26 cases, put them in an Excel spreadsheet, color-coded them, and then mapped them. And one of the things I saw was that for every case, at least the cases you ran, you could get an A, or if you got an A in growth, it still resulted in an F for your total SBF score. So for me, that's not even reasonable. You know, if a teacher is growing a student, you know, at least one grade level a year, what more can you ask? So if that's real growth, I don't see how that can be an F school. So to me, that's just one example of how you would put some borders around the definition of an F school. And we should be looking for similar borders around the other letter grade designations.
I think that's good. And later on in this presentation, we're actually going to dig into some of the problems with the 3 through 8 accountability system that reflects exactly that, that talks about that specific set of cases that we ran at your request.
Mr. Morris, just to be, I know I'm being sort of very orthodox because I think it'll help us if we have at least a little bit of a consensus around these 2 slides going into the other. So I hear what you just shared as being maybe an amendment to like 2 under the purpose of accountability. Is there something you'd like to add or amend that addresses what you just shared, or is what is here sufficient? And does it encompass what you share?
Can I offer 2 thoughts and see if it resonates? I think that, one, if it's going to motivate, right, adults in the building, it has to actually motivate them. So I would actually put that working hard, moving a student, but still getting an F in that, does it motivate, and is it a fair assessment? I would put it in those 2 areas. It's not specifically called out, but it is definitely how I think about it.
I think it fits.
Okay. What else? I'd like to, are there other things?
Well, I just want to point in, what are we trying to accomplish when we say that high school accountability reflects college and career readiness standards? I like that, but then this isn't in line with 3.8. Like, to me, that's a little bit problematic in light of what Mr. Morris just said, that we have an accountability system where you can be moving students and getting an A for that, but an F overall. And so I think we put that in there because we believe there's a disconnect that high schools are getting letter grades that are higher than K-8. And the assumption is that high school is wrong. But what if it's K-8 that's wrong, right? We already know that buildings that are K-8 rather than K-5 score higher on the accountability system because of the breakdown of the years that they have in there. And so I would just like to say that it could be that high school is not inflating perhaps what we're doing at K-8, which is strictly proficiency and growth. If how we're measuring growth is messed up and not being rewarded, then it may be that high schools are not the ones that are out of line, it's K-8.
So you're suggesting that this needs to be words to say that it's not a fait accompli that elementary school, that high schools need to come down and elementary schools should either stay the same or go down. You're saying that maybe 3.8 should go up when we look at this, and high schools should come down a little bit, or maybe high schools stay the same.
Right.
It's
Yes.
any of those.
Like I don't think that the assumption needs to be that there's something wrong with high school when we already know there's something wrong with K-8.
But the part that I think I hear you saying, Dr. Davis, that would still be true is there still should be alignment.
Yes.
That part is true.
So instead of is in, it should be there is alignment with 3.8. And that could be.
Yes, and that can be either one of them can move. And I know that seems nitpicky, but I just want to really make sure we're not.
I was looking over the slides here, and I see a lot of whats. I'm not sure where the how question comes into play. So one of the things that we talked about as a group before was how this is going to be rolled out, and assuming that there are changes made. And one of the things we talked about was that there was a lot of interest in rolling it out as a forward-looking tool, as opposed to a punitive measure. And there really are a lot of positives here if the perception is that it's a tool. And it's a tool that can be used to recognize schools that are doing well and providing them with the appropriate accolades. At the same time, recognizing schools that aren't doing so well and providing a level of resolution so we know what kind of help they need and how we can meet those needs. So I think how we roll it out is really critical as well.
I agree. I think that's part of our action items. We should begin developing that process, and that's probably part of our stakeholder engagement and feedback process. So we
Mr.
really
Mel-
could roll one. I think.
Mr. Mellerin?
Yeah, I think it touches the last bullet point where on the left, where it talks about ensure the results are clear and easy to understand. To add to that, or maybe, Dr. Davis, maybe, to rewording or just expanding on it, so like you and I talked about it is, yeah, well, transparent
Transparent.
is, so that schools know this is how we're doing it. As Ms. Moore said, not a black box. This is very clear, this is what we're doing, this is how you're gonna get your grade. Parents can look at it and say, this is what this means. Stakeholders can look at it, we can look at it, and there's no, you and I have talked about, the growth model, it's kind of a black box to a certain extent where it comes in, and then if you get to step 2, it comes out in ways. Transparency, I guess, would be there. I don't know where that
Ensure the
is.
results are clear, aligned,
Do you think
transparent.
it goes further than what's there for 2A?
Understand, communicating. Maybe.
My kind of, to get a wordsmith again, like with understanding, I don't know if it means, I don't know if everybody will be able to understand it no matter what we do, but if it's there and we're not hiding anything with it, I think that should be the goal.
Yeah.
Again, it's a complicated thing. No matter how we do it, it's going to be complicated.
Yeah.
And so, as
Are
long
you
as we're
looking for the word
putting,
transparent in there?
well, just making sure that that's there. Like that's at the end. That's kind of one of our goals is that we are being transparent with everything.
Yeah.
I think that it's clear, transparent, and easy to understand.
Yeah, that would be. And I think the intent is there from this, but just again, so we're clear and everybody knows this is what we're doing.
Makes sense.
Great. Ms. Holloway, anything you'd like to add?
No, just following, I'm trying to get a clear picture. What are we doing? How are we gonna do this? And when, like Ronnie was saying, rolling it out. I like the idea of, like Belinda said, understanding it, because we're targeting a certain grades for high school, but yet, how do we not know about 3rd through 8th? And
So,
it's easier.
as we go through this, we're going to look at growth, of issues with growth. We're going to take a lot of feedback and thoughts, and we're hopeful that you'll say to me, go run simulations based off what you've heard today, come back with simulations, and then we're going to do the same thing with high school, so that I'll do a lot of work and stakeholder engagement over the next month, run a bunch of cases to share that back with the group so that we can look at what do the letter grades do when you do this, like what is going down, what's going up, what is happening with elementary school, what looks different if we move some weights around. So today is about making sure that we're completely aligned here, making sure that we understand after having built all the knowledge around how does the growth model work. We're not going to go through step 1 and step 2 today because we've done that, right? Today we're going to go through what's not working in step 1 and step 2.
Will you be able to show us where we are now versus what the simulation will look like if you do this,
Yes.
so we can see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, whenever we run a simulation, we try very hard to be able to show you this is what the closest thing is to what we're changing currently so that you can actually see apples to apples comparison.
I had 2 other comments. In the bold discussion question, what are we trying to accomplish in assessing our current accountability system? So if I reflect back on what really started this work process, right? There were several initiatives before the board that would provide additional incentives for student performance. And there was some reservation amongst the board about how the accountability system would actually respond to the implementation of those initiatives. So when we ask the question, what are we trying to accomplish in assessing our current accountability system, just want to keep it on the radar that one of the things, this group, I'm assuming is going to be coming back to the full board with, is recommendations that we're going to address the potential rollout of those initiatives.
So I do think that might not be captured here. So maybe a specific eye toward the proposals that came in June and whether or not we think those need to be woven in or are they already woven into what we wind up doing. Because a lot of that was around college and career readiness and incentivizing behaviors to get good long-term outcomes for high school students. And then for K2, it was kind of pushing around like school quality and like classroom quality, measuring that and literacy. So I think that maybe just like a study of the June proposals compared to our current the simulations that we run, and determine should we do these things or shouldn't we do these things.
Right.
Does that feel right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I think the sequence on that will matter because, and I appreciate you, Mr. Morris, sort of taking us back to sort of the origin of the work group. As I recall, it was really about wanting to ensure there was a comprehensive approach to the form, to whatever changes we were making, and then figuring out how to assess whatever was getting proposed in the context of that comprehensive approach. So I think we're taking the steps to get to a comprehensive answer. What I hear you saying is at some point we have to loop back and look at those specific proposals relative to that.
Right. And then the other comment I had was the second bullet, maintain our proficiency goals. So when I think about that, I go to the BESE website, and basically it says BESE's responsibility is to reach every child and provide them with an opportunity to compete in an ever increasingly competitive global economy. Okay, so there's global proficiency right there, right? That's the charge for the board. Then there's another conversation that says maybe they should be able to compete nationally, right? Then maybe there's another conversation that says, well, they should be able to compete in Louisiana, right? So I know in the existing, and we're going to get into the weeds of this in a minute, but in the existing algorithm, we look at proficiency relative to this defined mastery, and if you don't achieve a certain point, then you go to the BAM assessment, which you did this already, and in my mind, that's the backyard assessment, right? I'm comparing the student that's in the row next to me in the classroom, which is my backyard, right? It's not a national standard, so it's not a global standard. So I'm really interested in some conversation about recognizing incremental proficiency towards the grade level achievement, right? If that's a standard we're going to hold everybody to, then I think that should remain the standard. But we should give partial credit for getting there, right? Relative to that standard, not relative to the student in the aisle next to me. Because I don't think that's the right place to set the bar, personally.
I think we should keep moving. If we feel like amongst this study group, this slide reflects 90% or better of our alignment, then we should keep moving. I appreciate the conversation on the table. I think at a certain point in time, solutions will be where we are. Right now, I think we should just try to spend the time really understanding the parts of the model that this group has asked us to learn.
And I think that will be covered a little bit when we talk about growth, and we can keep FAN is definitely top of mind as we go through these exercises. So, okay, growth. So we want to start off with what are the problems with growth in the formula. We've talked about some of these, but I tried to capture and synthesize what we kind of talked about, and we're going to share some data around this with you all. So one, it awards points for non-growth, including students who decline, and we'll share some data in a minute on that. Growth is not recognized equally in how the formula rates our school's overall performance. For example, step one doesn't value all growth equally. We'll share some data on that in a second. And achievement is mixed into the growth index. So it's not a pure growth index. It actually includes student achievement level through a couple of floors that are in there. And we'll share some data on that. And then the last thing is, no matter how much growth a student below BASIC has, the school will still earn an F in the calculation for school performance until the student reaches BASIC. So to your point earlier and conversations that we've had, these are some of the challenges with the growth formula. Any other things that folks want to add to this list of problems that you all have caught on to? But I think this captures pretty well everything we've talked about.
I just think on number 3, if you can say a sentence or two more about why that's problematic.
I think that if one of our values is motivating adults, it's really hard to be motivated if the best you can receive, no matter how hard you work, is an F. I think that's a conversation and a tension that we have to sit with and understand, right? Like, can you motivate someone if you tell them no matter how hard you work, you will receive impact. And I think that that's why it was important to get aligned on these values, because it is a hard question.
And I think it's really crucial when we think about kindergarten readiness that, over 50% of our kids are showing up for kindergarten not ready to learn. And so that is, these teachers are moving kids, and that is not reflected in our accountability system, right?
It becomes a question, right? Like, a student's academic achievement, right, is the combination of like, how ready were they when they arrived, which like, the state has some ability to do things like incentivize early childhood education, all of those things. Otherwise, student wellness, all those types of things. And then it's, what was the impact of the school on that student, right? And the question is like, are you incentivizing, are you like rewarding people for like super fast movement? Is that super fast movement like reasonable, right? Like, can that even be expected? And I think that's something we're gonna have to grapple with as we dig through the next couple slides. Any other things to add here? Okay. So the first issue that we want to talk about is step 2 of work points for non and negative growth. And what I did was we pulled the VAM percentile students fall into, the number of points you earn for that percentile, and the percent of scores coming from students that declined in scale score. So in the top 20% of students on the VAM, you get 150 points, and about 14% of those were for negative scale score growth. So 86% of kids-ish see an increase, because there's also non-movement in here that I didn't cover, but most students are seeing improvement. For some students, what the VAM does is it looks at what was expected and how much did the school exceed that. And what that means for those students, the expectation was that student was going to decline a lot, and that school made sure that that student didn't decline nearly as much. And you see that carry out all the way down, and then when you get down to the 40 to 59th percentile, you see that about 60% of students are actually seeing negative scale score change. So they're not growing, and that's why I put negative growth, right? Because growth is, for most people's thought process, is positive. But this is regression or decline. So comparatively, right, like it was worse. It's worse than what they did last year. But compared to their peers, right, the school did better than the peers would have done.
Okay, can you explain it again?
Yep. Okay. So in step 2, we do the thing. So step 1 is absolute, did they make their progress toward mastery? Step 2 is, compared to their peers, what was expected for that student to achieve this year based off actual data, what happened to the particular students, right? And how much did the student exceed that expectation, right? So if they meet the expectation, it's 0, right? They didn't exceed it by any. If the school got that kid 2 more points, even if the expected was -4, if they got -2, they exceeded it by 2 points. That -2 student could be theoretically in this column, in this negative growth column. The school did better with that student than what was expected for that student to do, though it was still not positive growth. And you see that like it's a very small number in that top group, but it does get larger and larger and larger as you go down. Reflections?
Do you have, why does it get larger?
It could be a lot of things, right? Like, I think that it could be, the distance that the student had to travel, right? Like, I think that as you get lower and lower in achievement levels, the distance to mastery actually grows and grows and grows. So that could be part of it.
Can you determine at least the population of these kids that's
Oh, we can do
falling
that.
into that?
Yeah, we could look at it by student group.
That'd be interesting to know.
And grade level.
Why, what's your theory? What's the
At-risk population, are they really, are their needs being met to the fullest? And to be able to reach up into the 100%.
And by
And
grade
who are
level?
by grade level, yeah, Ronnie said grade level. Socio,
Here's what I think we should do. We'll just keep moving through the issues, and then we can come back and go through once we've kind of got a whole picture of the growth conversation. The next thing that I want to talk about is that step one does not value all growth equally. So the question is, do we want to value all growth equally? And to paint this picture, I did 2 example students, 2 third graders. The first student scored 650. They were unsatisfactory on their exam. In 4th grade, they increased 19 points. They get 0 accountability points for that student. Versus the second student, who was at 725, their step 1 expectation was 5. They get the 5, and they get 150 points.
This makes me crazy, right? Like this is something that I just don't understand why we have structured the accountability system this way. And so, and I get that it's because that child is supposed to be growing, 20 points or whatever it is on their growth to mastery, but this is punishing schools that are starting out with the kids that are furthest behind.
Just to clarify, Thomas, the reason why it's 0 is because the student was below basic? Is that, why is it 0?
So they get 0 because they did not, in step 1, it's an all or nothing, right? If you need, so this student needs to get to 750, right? In order to get points, you divide the distance they have to travel by the number of years that they have to travel there, and that gives you the goal. So student B only needs to go 25 points. They've got 5 years to do it. Their goal is 5 points a year. Student A, they are in the lowest achievement category. They have much further to travel, which means they have to make 19 points, they make 20 points of improvement every single year to get there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
My question, I think, goes to what you and I talked about. What was I think this before all of us were here when we did this, what was the reason for giving 0 or 0 points for everything below the basic? You know, does anybody remember?
I was here, but I don't remember,
It's this idea of our bar being mastery, right? And the secondary idea of replacing that with student growth, right? Like saying 0 points here, but we're going to give you points for growing students to kind of counteract that.
But it's relative to a different standard.
well, I think it's about high expectations. Am I misunderstanding? That is the spirit of it, right? It's to say that if you move a student, but that student is still below basic, have we actually done our job in preparing the student for any number of things, right? I think that was.
It's having high expectations, but also not recognizing the fact that some schools have to work harder to get their student bodies to mastery than others do. Right, so everybody's got high expectations, but this right here is not recognizing the schools that are working with the kids that have the biggest they have, so they're starting out behind these other schools, and so that's just problematic.
To follow up, so they would get 0 points in step 1. How many points would they get in step 2 under the current model?
It would depend on a lot of characteristics of
It's
the
not, okay, that's right.
It would be impossible.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
But again, it's relative to their peers.
Yeah,
Right? It's not the same standard.
yeah, it's not the same thing. So that makes sense what you're saying, it's possible, because you have to know, you can't just look at one individual, you have to look at all the
Because you
others.
can get 150 points
Yeah.
if you're doing well relative to your peers.
Exactly.
Which is not the same as the kid that got 150 points because they're on
On
proficiency.
mastery.
Right.
But what I like about this example though is this, relative to their peers, this student grew 14 more points than that student. So I think that it is important to acknowledge that tension. And it's like a hard tension, right? Because ultimately students need to get to proficiency, right? That is really important to us and to their life outcomes. But also, how do we make sure that we're valuing all of the other things that we value around motivating the adults in the building, making sure that it's clear and transparent and accurate and trusted. It's challenging. And I hope you see, we tried really hard to pull together like good examples of like, this is not a super simple, easy, gonna figure it out with us sitting here together. This is gonna require me and the team to go back and like really spend a lot of time understanding where your values sit on these things.
That's a great thing.
Thomas, before we go on, and this might have to do with the analytics that you're gonna, run, but when you think about like student A being representative of some population, some percentage of students across our system, and student B being representative of another percentage, can you just size, is this, how many, like what percentage of students might find themselves working as hard as they've worked to make 14 points, but still actually not getting any points, or the reverse? What percentage? Is this a small percentage? Is this relative to the whole system?
It would be hard to tell you, but we can find out, figure it out.
You know what I
But
mean?
isn't it 60% or so that aren't at proficiency? Is that right now?
So it would basically be,
So your whole pool is 60%, and you're asking for some subset of 60%.
that's correct.
But, from the whole perspective, 60% of the kids aren't there right now, right?
Right.
So they're not using band.
Right. The challenge is that as you get like basic, right, there are a lot of students sitting at basic. So that comes out of there because their distance to travel is actually much less than student A, right? Like student B is that student that is at basic versus students that are below basic. But we can work on that. Anything else here?
well, the only other thing I'd share for, like, and this maybe goes without saying, but what's interesting to me is in the system, if we have schools within our systems that are able to move 14 percentage points, right? We want to know who those schools are and we want to learn from them, right? So our system should incentivize us to want to learn from them, but right now, if I'm correct, there would be nothing in our system that would flag that we should learn from this school because based on the number of points, that school might still be designated a failure if at scale this was happening across their whole building. Is that the right assumption that I can make?
That's a really good assumption. And I think that it kind of gets muddy when you look at, like, this is the step where that kind of starts to get muddy, right? Like,
Okay.
there are a lot of points being earned in this relative to peers, and there are a lot of points being earned, 60% of 8 points of 85, right, which is pretty good, are actually being achieved for negative scale score change. So yes, it is masking that. Not to say that I think necessarily that we should throw the entirety of this model out of the window, because this indicates something, like that's a relatively small percentage that we could look at and figure out, is there something directionally right here, or is it completely wrong? Because I do think that to motivate individuals, right, motivate teachers, there are things that you need to take into account when we know that the odds are stacked against an educator. How do we make sure that we're incentivizing them to work with that student? And that could be measured in a lot of ways. But I would say, don't discount this entire step because of the way that we've implemented VAM. The VAM, right, all it does is it lines up the kids. The question is, how do you assign them points? You could easily say, we're not going to award points for any negative scale score growth and keep VAM. You could do that.
Yeah.
And that would literally, overnight, all those would become zero in the right-hand column.
Right, which is why I don't believe it's necessary for us to like jump to solutions, because I feel like if we understand it, what I hear you saying is there could be multiple ways to solve a problem if we're clear on where the problems are.
That's right.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, the next issue is achievement is mixed in the growth index. So when a student scores mastery, the school is guaranteed to earn 85 points, even if that student regresses in scale score, because they have a mastery floor of 85. That's not included in the previous slide, by the way. These students are not included in the previous slide. And then a student who scores advanced is guaranteed to earn 150, which is a little bit more complicated because our advanced lower bound scale scores change over time. So this one is less helpful to talk about. It would be a lot of detail for us to dig into. But the first one is one that I think that we just need to flag and talk about. schools that serve students who are at mastery have a floor of 85 points, period, right? So that they are not growing a kid and they are still getting a good score on the growth index. They're not moving them toward advanced proficiency.
Do you mean if a child comes in already at that level, I have automatic points?
85.
Okay.
And we can come back to any of this. Okay, the next issue, no matter how much growth a low-performing student has, the student is still going to have the calculation of the SDS until they reach basic. So, real quick example, student A scored approaching basic and meet their step 1 target. They earn a maximum of 150 for their growth. But if they're a K8, and this is a simplified example, the formula is much more complicated, so this is accurate but not necessarily precise. The points earned for the student is 39.5. They got 150 for growth, they got 0 for assessment, and that turns out to about 39.5, which is in math. You could tinker around with this INO included in there or not, but like you're somewhere between 37.5 and 40, and it's in math.
Well, can you say something just about that sentence on the bottom?
If a school starts with all approaching basic students, if you're a 3rd and 4th grade, all of your students are approaching basic, or some are unsat, some are approaching basic, and you grow all of them. You meet step 1, forget van, you like meet step 1. You are going to be an F for now. If you only have 3rd and 4th grade.
And so is this right here one of the reasons why when you have K-8 in a building, their letter grades are higher? Because this is just mathematically not possible, right? Like if they're at a certain level of approaching basic, and even though they're growing those kids, they're never going to reach mastery in the allotted time. Is that right? Like if they only have it?
I mean, it depends on where the students come in, right? It depends on a lot of factors, but that's certainly directionally, right? Like if you have a lot of students coming in behind and you are growing them, right, at the clip that is expected, right?
Right.
If you have 5 years to do it versus if you have 3 years to do it, you're gonna have fewer kids meeting that step 1 expectation.
So the middle school that gets them later gets the grade that essentially the K through 4th or 5th grade school was producing. So we've got the K5 that's an F, and then their middle school is going to end up reaping the rewards of all of the growth that they were doing. And you'll see that in the accountability score for that school, but not in the elementary school that moved them the required points in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade.
That's pretty close.
Okay.
The question is like the thing is, achievement is how prepared was the student when they came to you and how much did you grow them,
Yeah.
right?
I'm not sure I understand the no way part of it. I can get it if you get an A in growth, you get an F. But if you test out at the end of the year proficient, then you get an F.
Until they reach basic. So if a student reaches basic, if they grow 50 scale score points or whatever, right? Like that's true.
Right.
But then you're talking about more than just meeting your step 1 expectation, right?
But I don't think no way applies, does it?
It probably needs, unless they earn basic, like it says at the top. Yep.
And again, a question just about scale, like what percentage of schools across our state have the majority of students who are coming in approaching basic?
We can have that for the next meeting. It's also, we could do 3rd grade. We could look at 3rd grade.
Let's just look at 3rd grade.
Okay. Discussion. Should we award points for negative growth? If no, are there exceptions?
Why would you award points for negative growth?
I mean, the simplest, the first one that I would just throw out is, once a student reaches advanced, the advanced scale changes, the lower bound of advanced changes. So that scale is actually more complicated. So I would award points personally if a student got to advanced and stayed advanced, even if their scale score went down 2 or 3 points, because it is very hard to measure on that end, for one. And two, literally, if you look at the scale score, it, like the lower bound for advanced dips eventually. So it just changes over time.
Is that your exceptions?
Sure, that's one exception.
Well, mastery's proficiency's mastery, then if they don't decline, that might be another area.
Okay.
Well, we've got the 85 floor and they're ready for that, right?
So they,
The question is, should the 85 floor be there,
Right.
right?
So the same question, 150 for advanced.
I mean, I'll throw out a devil's advocate just to get us started, and then maybe someone will feel strongly enough about it that they'll argue the reverse, but should we award points for negative growth? I guess you can make a case that if you have 2 schools and they all have kids who are far behind, and one school is growing them more, even if it's not growing them as much as the other school, right? If I'm understanding correctly. But they are actually growing them more than the other school. Right now, that could still be negative growth. But they are actually outperforming a school that has the same demographics. Is that the most compelling, damn purist argument?
That is.
Okay.
But then you're getting back to, what is your relative standard, right? If I understand it correctly, am I going to start comparing my results relative to another school in the state? Or am I going to compare my results relative to where we set the bar for proficiency?
That's the question.
I don't know why we would compromise personally. That's my view. But I do think that we should be able to award points for incremental growth. Clearly, whether you're in advanced or mastery or wherever, teachers working hard to get that growth, whether or not it's a student at one level or another level, they're growing kids, they should get credit for it. You have to incentivize that, or why else are we going to do it, right?
We'll come back with more data around this just to be helpful, because some of the things I'm going to say probably require like an additional study and looking at. If somebody's in the top 20% of BAM, that means that they exceeded that negative expectation by a lot,
Okay.
right? Like, I mean, they exceeded it by more than most people, right? Like, they exceeded it by more than 80%, right? So like, that means that they are doing something and that they still were negative. So I think that it's worth us understanding more about this, because when you talk to educators, they are going to push and say that like,
That's right.
work with the student. There are cases where we are beating the odds here, and the question is, how do you incentivize and reward them for working with student populations that we know in the data are likely to decline?
Ask a question, like, have we looked at, when we think about this negative growth and where all these kids are coming from, is there a particular subject matter test that dominates this? Like, I'm just thinking about what happens when our kids take that 8th grade mathematics leap, right? And there's a huge decline in kids that are reaching mastery, like, I guess I'm trying to figure out when we're seeing all of this expected negative growth and these kids are basically not as negative as we thought they would be, which is essentially what this is insinuating. So I'm just wondering if there's one particular leap assessment that is causing all of this, or do you think it's clearly diverse across all the ages and all the leaps?
Yep. But we can spend time together and talk about what it would look like to paint that picture for the group so that they can understand that it was pretty wrong.
I don't know how you had time to sleep with all those simulations.
I wrote the workbook for you. So.
Can I just clarify, Mr. Morris, your point, the last one you made, am I drawing the right conclusion though that you would basically then say there are cases where we should award points for negative growth if in fact there was incremental progress? Like, I really want to understand your last point about incremental progress and how that connects to the growth conversation, the negative growth conversation.
Well, I think the overall objective here is that every child would reach their maximum capacity, right? Every child reaches uses their God-given ability to reach their maximum capacity, and that's growth. And so I think that we should recognize that incremental growth, regardless of what level you're at.
Matters.
That's right. But then the other side of that conversation is, the base case today, which says, okay, once I've achieved a certain point, am I going to get penalized because I didn't grow within that level, right? To me, I think that's the most challenging question here. And I don't know that I have the answer, but I think that's the most challenging question. But I sincerely believe that incremental growth should be recognized and incentivized so that we can all achieve our maximum capacity.
So you would say that if the question is, should all growth be measured equally or awarded equally, you would say that it should be based off the percent of the expected goal. So that means that if somebody has a wider goal, they have a longer goal, they're going to get less points than somebody who has a shorter goal. So like if they've got to move 5 and they get 80% of the points for moving 80% of 5, 4, somebody's going to get fewer points for getting, 8 points of improvement, even though they needed to move 20 because that was less than 50%.
So that's your individual capacity, right? Somebody's estimated your capacity is here. Somebody else's capacity is there. You set your target relative to your forecasted capacity.
But it's not individualized capacity, it's about how many points do they have to get each year to get to mastery,
Okay.
right?
Start.
So, yeah.
We're talking about just step.
Oh, you're right, I get it, yeah.
And that's why these things sit in tension together, right? Like, should the school that has to move the student 20 points and they move them 10, get half the points compared to the school that moved the kid 5 points?
Right, but that's getting me to mastery, right? I thought the conversation we were having was mastery and beyond.
We're talking about both at the same time. Mastery and beyond is a different part of this.
But I thought that's what we were talking about in that last slide was the relevant question is if I've achieved mastery, but I didn't grow very much within mastery, right? Do I still get recognized at that level? Or am I going to get penalized once I reach that level because I didn't grow relative to that next goal,
I'm
right?
a terrible facilitator. I didn't even go to the next question. Yeah, I'm with you.
Kind of, but like if you still go back to the student A and B. Like there's still a question that I think you're raising about whether or not all growth should be equal. You just framed it like that the student A has further to go than student B. Can you just frame that again for us? I think it's an important point.
Yeah, both of these students have to get to 750, right? This student has to walk a lot further every day to get there. One kid has to get to the Mississippi border and one kid has to get to Alabama or New York, right? Like, and this is where the two things sit in tension. Like, should there be the urgency, right, to move this student faster? And how much urgency? And what should a reasonable expectation be, right? Does that matter? I think that's a question to talk about as a group.
Yeah. I mean, so the urgency, in my opinion, the urgency part is measured in the proficiency part of this. And so it bothers me that when we're talking about growth, we're still really talking about proficiency too, right? And so I find the fact that student A gets a 0 incredibly problematic. Like this is one of the things that makes me, the craziest when I think about the accountability system. Because I just don't see how that is fair to the student, the teachers that are in the classroom, and then at the whole building level. That right there, he grew or she grew 19 points and is being given a 0 because they showed up in kindergarten not ready for kindergarten, right? And so this one.
Do you have a problem with student B as well, Belinda?
I mean, I don't know how I think that student B should get points as well, because they did move and there was growth, but I don't see how their growth is so much better than student A. Right, I mean, so I think student B and their school should be rewarded for that growth. But I think that student A is being treated unfairly.
I think that when I hear incremental growth, the thing that I struggle with is if you do an incremental growth, you go like, they get 80% of the points because they got 80% of their growth mastery target. That student is never going to arrive. If they do that every single year, they will never arrive at mastery. And that's where these things kind of sit in tension with each other. And should all growth be valued equally? Like, you could solve this another way, right? You could say, student B doesn't get any points because we think both of their goals should have been 10. We think that 10 is the minimum movement that a student can make, or 12, or 13, or 15, or 14. There are a lot of different ways to think about this. So the question is, do we want a model that values all growth equally, or do we want a model that that values growth more equally? Do we want to set a minimum expectation for student scale score movement in order to get an A?
Maybe that's the question a different way. Why would you value all growth equally?
I mean, Thomas's argument would be because if you do that, that means some students are never going to be at mastery, right? So that's what I heard Thomas just say. And so the question is, is growth that is not going to get a child to mastery valuable? I say yes, but some people would disagree.
I would say that that's close to what I would say, but what I would say differently is that I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that you could set the bar high enough that everyone would get to mastery. You could set the bar to be the minimum growth expectation to get, and this is like a modest proposal, right? Like, you could set the goal to be, if a student starts at 650, the minimum number of points that he has to grow is 20, so that every student can get to proficiency by the time that they exit. You could do that. It's not a either or. You could do that, but it has to sit in tension with, is that reasonable?
Well, what's the average growth?
In scale score points, it varies by grade. I can get that specifically.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
It's much less than that.
What is it,
Much
like,
less.
give us, okay, let's pull it down.
When we talk about value, that's the issue here, is value, right? How do you recognize value? And so some of us may recognize value as work. How hard did I have to work to get a certain distance, right? That's one way to recognize value. Another way to recognize value is, okay, I actually got there, wherever there is. But if I look at it from an educator's perspective, working with student A and student B, student A is approaching basic, student B is at mastery already. Is it harder work for incremental growth with student A than it is with student B? Or is that work equally challenging? Because if the work is equally challenging, something like the value would be equivalent. But if it's easier, right, to grow a student that's already at mastery to advanced, that's easier, right? Then it seems to me like that would have less value. What does the form of education say?
Well, what does the data say?
I think the expert
How many
just walked in the
students do
room.
we have that have moved students from mastery to advanced? I mean, we have data on how easy or hard that's been for us.
There's very little movement from mastery to advanced. It's, across the grade levels, it's pretty consistent. And I think that it varies from student to student, right? Like, what is the reason why the student is entering high grade level? Like, there's just so many factors. It's hard to quantify because the scale score change, right? The scale score is calculated, and I shared some information with you, so I'm going to repeat something that you read recently, is it's built around this idea of how complex were the questions and how complex was the test. So there's like there's a wider gap in those lower achievement bands. It's more points to grow, but I think how hard is it for each individual student varies by student characteristic, which is part of why I would assume the BAM model was selected in order to do step 2.
I still get back to the general question, though, just from I realize every student's different, right? But conceptually, I'm trying to understand the value of the growth, right? And how difficult it is for an educator to move a student from approaching basic to basic, as opposed to just one level, right? As opposed to how challenging it is to move a student group, not a particular student, from mastery to advanced. Is it generally speaking more challenging one way than the other, or is it the same?
I think that that's part of what the BAM model attempts to do. It attempts to take a bunch of factors, put them together, and say that based off all the things I know about this student, this is how relatively hard it was to move that student, right? Like, this student, on average, would have declined 2 points.
Okay, we're getting back to the individual student case. I'm interested in the general student population, right? You look at all the kids that right now are approaching basic, look at all the kids that are at mastery, right? As a group, if you talk to educators, what are they going to tell you? Is it more challenging to work with this group, or is it more challenging to work with advance the other group incrementally?
They're targeting the lower sector of kids for money.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I think that it's a harder question to answer than like,
But that's what we're talking about, is where's the value, right?
we could run some data on like that specific question, right? Like how much movement is there from unsatisfactory to approaching basic over time? We could also have the BAM model run that literally just looks at just achievement level and compares students at particular achievement levels. And that will start to get at the empirical as opposed to asking a bunch of individuals like this, like which group of student is most challenging for you, which is a different question than which group of students is harder to move if you're using the right pedagogical approaches,
That's right.
all of those types of things.
Two quick things, point of privilege as chair, just want to recognize Dr. Brumley, glad you are here. Feel free to come over if you want to be part of it. Second thing is maybe a one-way in, because I could see us as a study group basically just like, these are hard questions that you all are faced with. It might be easier for us to actually name the thing that would help us get a better answer. So for example, Ms. Holloway, you had to answer the second bullet, and this is not just for Sandy, but for anyone, like what data would you need to see? What perspective would you need to hear from that would help you answer that for yourself, right? And maybe you feel like you have the answer. Some of us at this table have already said where you feel like you are. Belinda's made it clear where you are on the first bullet. But for places where we are unclear, what is the data that would be helpful or the perspective that would be helpful to get clarity there?
So to go off the first one, what Thomas said about if you're at advanced where that bar fluctuates, are there any other areas where it fluctuates? So that's something that changes potentially. Like if a kid is at advanced and then the bar drops, so they drop from advanced to mastery, that's something that is important to know where it's not a proficiency standard where mastery is hard, bright line, you're at proficiency, it never changes. So for that one, and you're shaking your head no, so that answers my question.
Yeah, up to mastery, it's. I think I'll summarize a couple things that I've heard. I knew that this was going to be like a robust conversation, that I didn't think we were going to have like any kind of like whole group, this is where we should go. What I did hear is that like, generally speaking, negative growth, negative scale score change is challenging and problematic. We need to figure out how to address that in the formula. So I think that I heard that for sure. Are there certain achievement levels that should be exempt from growth expectation? I think that I heard that like once students reach advanced because of the scale score thing, just like leave that alone for now, and we can come back to that later, because that is a small sliver of our group of students, and we could study it more, but we should probably spend more time at students below mastery. And I heard general agreement around this idea that like student growth should be valued pretty equally, right? Like people struggled with this question. No, I don't think that we have to answer it, but I think that everybody was like, this feels weird, so we want to know like how many kids fall into this category.
Yeah, yes, but I didn't hear conviction. I heard open question, right? Kind of hesitation. And so I was just trying to figure out across the study group, like what other data points would lead you to have conviction one way or another about this reality, other than what we've already asked Thomas to pull.
Is there conviction?
Is there conviction?
I mean, I think that this is wrong, right? So I have a problem with student A. And so the question is trying to figure out how to reward student B who grew, but how to not penalize student A who grew even more than student B, but did not meet their growth to mastery target for that year. Right, so I don't necessarily have a solution for this problem. I just know that for me, this is incredibly problematic.
Okay.
I think what it boils down to, right, is growth relative to a standard versus individual growth. And that's the bottom line. It's two different things.
I think that what would be, so we're going to run some simulations, but I think what will help answer this question is that question around, are certain groups, certain achievement levels moving faster than others, which could be a proxy for how hard is it to move a particular achievement level with students. It won't be the answer, but it will give some direction.
It would be very helpful.
Never thought.
I think like bullet 2 though felt like another place where I think there was like broad range of perspectives across the group. Is that suffice to say?
I think that we kind of, I think I've got enough to go on with these two together. I think I've got enough to go on without belaboring.
Okay.
And then I guess this last question that we didn't spend a lot of time on that I think is really important as I think about simulations.
So what about the
is,
third bullet?
should certain achievement levels be exempt from growth expectation? My takeaway was it sounded like advanced was for sure one. I guess we should ask this question. Should the expectation be that schools move students from mastery to advanced?
My take on number 3 is no. I would say no, because they should always be expected to grow. Who's reached their maximum potential? I don't know anybody.
So I agree with Ronnie. Kind of my hesitation is that if you say, look, you get a kid to advance, don't worry about it from there on, then you're going to take our best and brightest students and you're going to push them to the side and you run the risk of them just being pushed off and say, here's your work, go do it yourself, let me help these other kids and grow them. And you're potentially wasting the very brightest students in Louisiana, and you're not giving them, potentially de-incentivizing the teachers from putting effort with them. So I don't think at the top level you need to. I think across the board we should always be striving to get our kids, regardless. Look, if our kid, as Dr. Davis said, some kids may never make that mastery, like, we should be striving to get it even if they will never do it. And I don't think we should be putting in like an off-ramp or anywhere for a teacher to say, well, that's not going to get my school points, that's not going to get me any points, let's not put focus there. Because it does a disservice to the kid, regardless whether that kid's in college or that kid's going to
But I never saw it before until this discussion, and I think that's what's happening. Like I was telling you, that educators are targeting your lower performing school students that are approaching or even in basics to try to get them to that growth. And because they know your mastery or advanced students are going to get it no matter what. So they pretty much stay at that level they're at. And And if we don't incentivize that advanced, that's what's gonna happen. They're gonna stay.
And I'll just say, from talking to friends who were in a gifted program in some sort of public school, so that they felt, now looking back, where at certain points in the day, they were kind of said, here's your work, you go do this, I'm gonna go. And now, that may be that group of kids, but I've seen it, and I've talked to friends and colleagues and things, when they were in the high school or in certain areas where that happened. I don't think
Yeah,
we.
and it's not that you're blaming it, it's the system, it's the program that encourages it,
Yeah.
that particular.
And I don't think it was done intentionally, it was just, hey, this student may need a little bit more work, you're okay, I can give you this work knowing that you're still gonna grow, you're still gonna be okay, but they're not, a little bit of extra push towards it.
And you're gonna bank 85 points as long as you don't fall below mastery.
And if you wanna look at it in a very
Yeah.
I think it'd be really helpful, I'm compelled by that. I think it'd be really helpful as we're starting to build out this stakeholder list to figure out, like, what is the focus group that would help us understand this perspective more?
Any other thoughts here on this discussion?
On all three?
On the whole.
The whole thing? Oh, the last question we haven't gotten to.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I'll just say that at some point though, when you get to those high achieving kids that are at advanced, right, at some point they can't grow because it's mathematically impossible, right? And so that's, so let's just be clear, because my kids have gone to a magnet school and, a lot of the students are already at advanced and they're being told that they have to, grow so many points. It's like, well, that's just mathematically not possible for them to do, right? And so we've had, I think it was with the magnet school in Caddo, where everybody threw a fit because they got deemed for, they had so many advanced and they couldn't grow them, and so there was a big hubbub about it, so.
And that's where the nuance, where you could look at a model that says, okay, as long as there's not negative growth or something there, as long as if you're at that advance where you can't go any higher, you maintain at that point, don't be deemed, but get your full points as long as you're not dropping. And that's where you get into the sort of nuance part.
Here's where it gets challenging. In third grade in ELA, the bottom score for advanced is 810. In fourth grade, it's 790. So they're going to it's 810 is the floor for advanced in third grade. 20 points lower is where the floor for advanced is in fourth grade. So you could, in theory, drop 20 points, which is more than that kid, right? And still be advanced because of the measurement. So like, we'll come back with some more data around that. But I think that all of that's really important, right? Like, helping to push and grow all children is really important, both of the unsatisfactory approaching basic and above.
One more question to follow up on your point, Dr. Davis. Like, when you say it's mathematically impossible, can you just share why?
Because there's an upper bound, right? And so just like a kid can't have negative knowledge, they also can't show more than our assessment allows them to show.
Yeah.
And so if they're a high performer, and they're at that top score, they can't move, right? There's just less room for them to move. So if we were requiring 10 points of growth every year, right, that was just gonna be what we said, they can't do it.
Because if you got a test and the perfect score is 750 and they're at 750 or 745, they can't hit.
They can't go there, right?
It's gotta be cheap.
So it's really like the limitation of the assessment and stuff like.
Yeah. But then also too, like just from an equity perspective, right? Like I know we absolutely do want to be focused on our best and brightest and them learning. But the sense of urgency, right, is about those kids that are at the lower levels. And so, I mean, I think that in some respects, right, you're hard pressed to criticize a teacher in a classroom that is trying to spend most of her time on her struggling readers versus the kids that are already reading, at the 10th grade level and 4th grade. I mean, that's
Well, that gets back to the question though, where do you see the most incremental value, right? Do you see more incremental value at those lower levels or not? To me, that's a huge question that we talk about.
It's also part of why it's really hard to answer that question, even empirically in the data. The last thing that I kind of want to talk about, and this is really just a lot of thinking. At what point should a school earn the equivalent of an entire letter grade of improvement based off growth? At what point should they go from being, the school go from being an F to a D based off of growth? Or a D to a C based off of growth? Just like conceptually, how much growth is that?
I think it gets back to how you define letter grade, right? Another one of the comments was we should be able to really define each letter grade. This is what it takes to be an A, this is what it takes to be a B, et cetera, et cetera. And part of that conversation is, oh, you achieve X, Y, Z at the roads, right? That fits that definition. I don't have the answer.
Basically, just to clarify, you made this clear, but I want to make sure I understand it. Currently, there is no way that a student would make a full, no matter if they had an A on it, no matter how much growth, right now, this would not be possible.
For a student who's receiving 0 points in achievement or
Yeah.
assessment, that's true. If they're above that, if they're at basic, it's totally true, right? Because if you get 150, 25% of, like, that can happen. But the way that the formula works is
Right.
25% for growth, and then the rest is achievement. So if you get nothing for assessment, then it's really hard. It's impossible.
It's impossible.
All you need is 37 points.
Right.
So it can totally help you if the student's at basic or above. But if you're getting 0 because they're below basic, 37 plus 0 is 0. 37, sorry. Math. We'll come back to that conversation. That is a, think about that between now and the April meeting.
Well, no, I don't think you should let us off the hook, because I don't think we don't have to have the conversation, people have to have an answer, but I do think, again, if there's data you want to see, because we know April's going to be May, it's going to be June, and some of this stuff we could be thinking about for years.
Can you send us that data?
Yeah, so on this last point, I really am curious, like, what do you think, Thomas, we would need to see for us to have an informed point of view about full informed?
I think that I could show you the examples of exemplary growth and what happens in the formula. I think we could do that. I also think that this group kind of has to come to a place where it's deciding, should it be when somebody exceeds the growth expectation, right? Like, is it relative to expectations in VAM, or is it, this is the number of scale score points, or is it moving kids across an achievement threshold? Like,
That's right.
what are those things that I just think that we need to
Yeah,
spend a lot of time on, and I probably need to put a presentation together a lot like this one to just dig
Just on that.
through that.
yeah, because there are models that exist out there where this is happening in other states, and then, okay, right?
Cool. Do we want to take a break? Bio break, anything?
Feedback?
I'm good.
Good? All right.
Okay, we're going to talk about high school, shifting a little bit. So, problems with high school, scores are generally higher than 3rd through 8th grade. 70% of our high schools are currently rated A or B, while 41% are rated A or B if they're elementary, so that's a pretty significant difference. And you could argue which one is right, more right, one should come down, one should go up, but like, these are the data. High school proficiency grades do not look drastically different from 3 through 8 scores, but 9th through 12th grade SPS is significantly higher. And then the next thing that I would say is, because these scores are inflated, we are not communicating nor are we motivating the rigor needed for our graduates to be college and career ready. In order to incentivize, right, there has to be a reason to want to do the thing. And if 71% of the schools are A or B, for those 70%, there's very little motivation, right, to do something different. Would be what you would say if you think that accountability systems should incentivize or motivate adults to take certain actions or behaviors. So we're going to,
Hold on, go back.
any other problems with high school? Yes.
Can people agree with these two statements? And is there anything else you'd add?
I just don't like the assumption that the scores are inflated, because we don't, mean, we just spent a really big chunk of this day so far talking about the way we're not measuring growth in the best way possible, and so, I think that that's problematic. And then, I mean, when we think about high school proficiency rates not being drastically different than 3.8 scores, that's true, right? But we also expect our high schools to be doing more, right? There's a reason that we have 4 components to the index, and they do not just all revolve around proficiency. They revolve around strength of diploma, that if we start even, if we ever come to adopt, incentivizing career and college readiness more, right, inside of the high school accountability system, which I think that there's a lot of agreement that that needs to happen, then those scores are only going to go up, and it's because high schools are doing what we're asking them to do, which is to graduate kids with dual enrollment degrees and certifications in the career and technical path. Because those are very different things than proficiency on a LEAP test or an end-of-course exam. And so we can't value career and tech, and say we do, but then slam high schools because of their proficiency rates. I don't know, I mean, does that make sense?
Well, are we sure about that? Is that the accurate data?
The proficiency question, we're gonna dig into some data on the
Okay.
proficiency stuff in this.
And I would see it differently as inflation, I mean, I see it as inflation because you have 7% in high school and 41% in elementary. So my question is, why? What's the difference? What's causing this?
Because we value more than the LEAP score in high school. That's the whole,
Well, I think there are
that's
other
it.
variables
right?
too that
I promise we are
We're
about
gonna, we're
to,
gonna,
Yeah.
like, red Bill's
Exactly.
mind, totally red Bill's mind.
but can we just ask if there's anything else that people would add to this slide? Anything else that you see as potentially a problem worth looking at the high school level?
Well, I think that the initiatives that were brought before the board in June were intended to further incentivize performance in high schools and bring the two pathways more in alignment so that you're placing equal value for progression in each one. So that's not in place today, so it's something that's on the table. So I think those are significant initiatives that the board considered, so I think that's powerful.
Yep, so it comes to this question of, what does it mean to be college and career ready? Which is what those proposals were designed to do. And then the second question is there a motivation factor here, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the data around like, what are schools getting points for, just like we do with elementary school, so that we can all ground ourselves in scenarios like we do with elementary.
Although, to the point that was just made, the proposals that came before us in June, were they solving for points for the second bullet, or were they solving for something else?
It was, so it definitely increased the rigor at which schools earn points for students achieving credentials. So you had to get more AP credit, more dual enrollment credit, right? That's one part of the problem that we need to talk about today. The other part of the problem that we'll talk about is around like graduation expectations and what does it mean for a student to be a great graduate, that I think can couple nicely with the June proposal that I think that we can do better. But yes, it did a couple of things. It increased rigor in the top end of the points in that index, but that index is, I'm going to use the word inflated again, that index is inflated relative to everything else. The question is, are those other things deflated?
Yeah.
That's something that we need to figure out, but like, the question of inflation to me, I don't think it's debatable here, right? Like, it is inflated. The question is, how much and how much is this deflated? That's the question.
I think districts who are schools that are in this situation for, I'll go back to my past experience with elementary schools having C's, D's, even middle. And then the high school has an A. And you go, how does this happen when we know that we're working with these low risk schools and then they end up in high school making an A? And so that's what, and I think it's just a formula. I don't
And I'll
try to
just-
understand.
Yeah. That's that first point.
Yeah, and I would just say I'll channel my inner Doris Gaucher, right? It's because the mission of high school is different than K to 8. We have 4 years to prepare them for life outside of our classrooms. And so that looks very different for them, especially when you start thinking about career readiness, right? That those are that is a different goal. Yeah.
Let's dig into some data unless people have other problems to solve in high school. How do you say this? How are you?
I want to,
Yeah.
yes, please, just
We offered
want
Dr. Brumley a
to
slot.
acknowledge our executive director, Shannon Davis, just joined us.
Okay. So high school scores are higher than K-8, and assessment performance is pretty similar. So what we did here is we're showing the percents here of students by achievement level. You'll notice that this moves around a little bit, but not a whole lot. High school is a little bit complicated, just measuring some slightly different things, so I would be careful about drawing the assumptions right here. But you do see algebra, right? Like you see a little bit more students scoring advanced, but not a lot, right? And their assessment indices reflect that. There's not much of a difference between K-8 and high school assessment index. But when you look at the K-8 SPS versus the high school SPS, there's a pretty significant difference between a 72.7 and an 83.3. They are measuring two different things, but we don't see a ton of difference in this assessment index. So the question is that right, is that wrong? We're going to talk about that in a minute. So why are high school scores higher than 3? The high school formula is heavily weighted toward graduation outcomes, which results in a higher score for the majority of their formula compared to the 3. There needs to be broader alignment and higher expectations for college and career readiness expected in our formula if you want to help to try to solve for that. And then the next thing that we'll talk about in a second with some data is the ACT index doesn't accurately reflect readiness because non-jumpstart students were able to mask their lower ACT scores from a work piece assessment. This was part of the proposal of revisions that came in June. So here, we looked at elementary schools earlier, but we're going to show these high school indices here. High schools receive significantly higher scores for similar achievement. So we're going to compare two students with similar assessment profiles. Both students are scoring approaching basic, both students grow. The difference is one's an on-time graduate. And you'll notice that there's a slight difference here. Remember how I mentioned that we were using rough numbers. They both get 150 for growth. They both get 0 for assessment. Elementary schools don't have ACT and don't have graduation. And ultimately, one student scores 37.5 for the school, and one student scores 52.6, which is the difference between an F and a D for just graduating on time. No more ready, in theory, right? If you believe that this means you're ready and this means you're ready. They got them across the graduation stage, which is important. We've moved graduation rates significantly in the state, and we think graduation rates are important. But the question is this worthy of the difference of being an F versus being an E? And we don't need an answer to that right now. But,
37.5 and that,
yeah,
and the 52 is an A.
a D.
Oh, a D. Okay.
So we'll come back to this. So the next thing is points in the strength of diploma index don't align with the rigor of the credential. While we value a high school graduation, the strength of diploma index is awarding a lot of points for just being a diploma, regardless of the strength of said diploma. And you can see that here, where you look at the layout of points. Strength of diploma is way over here at the 94.8 versus our assessment indices, which we would argue are indications of how ready is the young person for the next step. This is way over here, way up here, and these are down here.
So remind me again of all the things that are counted in the strength of diploma, just to make sure I have them all that.
Yep, so where I'll start is for just graduating a student, they graduate in 4 years, you get 100 points.
Okay.
that, like, that's the start, right? Like, that's not the strength of the diploma, that is just the diploma. The rest of the strength of the diploma index, you can get 110 points for credential attainment or passing an AP class, literally passing the class, not the exam. And you get 110 points for that. If you take the AP exam to the 3-year high or AD, there's a variety of options there. You get 150, or an advanced credential falls into that category. And then if you get an associate's degree, it's 160 points. So the formula differentiates the outcome, but the question is, if 100, right, is what you're getting for just graduating, is the index actually measuring the strength of it? Maybe. It's like, did they get it or did they not get it, right? 0 or 100. But is 100 for the expectation strength?
Did the proposal in June, how did the proposal change the strength of diploma?
The proposal in June moved the expectation for the number of credits that a student would have had to earn in order to get those extra points. So it would go from one AP exam to an additional, right? And it would also add dual enrollment as an option that is equally weighted as the AP exam.
Is this, to the point of incentivizing, which we've named as one of our key purposes of the system we're building or looking at, is this incentivizing for kids to graduate on time and in 4 years?
I think it's a question of, is that the purpose of the strength of diploma index, or is that the graduation index, right? Right now we have a graduation index
And a strength of diploma.
and a strength of diploma, and right now in the strength of diploma index, graduating is getting you 100.
That's right.
So the question is, is there inflation? If you don't necessarily believe that just graduating is an A for strength, then yes.
Well, can you explain just what the graduation rate index then is too, since?
Yeah, that's essentially a multiplier of the school's graduation rate. So you lose some points. So imagine that your graduation rate is 75. You're going to get 75 times 0.9 for your points, so a little bit less than 75. And then if you're above 75, you get a little bit more points than your graduation rate. So that's pretty much a graduation rate measure.
What was the rationale for including them both when this happened? Europe, you were?
I think we need like a historical,
Does anybody remember?
I don't remember, but we can find out.
One thing, it's in statute that we have to, you may have discussed that already, it's in statute that there has to be an element of recognition for receiving that diploma or credential in the accountability formula
That's
for high school. I don't know that it's to the level of 100 points, but I know that is mandated by statute. I don't know what else you can offer.
So there's a variety of pieces of ESSA that require different parts to the formula and state law. If I had to guess why it was done, is one, we think that it's really important to incentivize students being ready for the next thing, and one way to measure that is college and career readiness, which is an option within the ESSA plan. You have to have five indicators, and that is one of the ones that you can add. So I think that that's probably a significant component of why it was included. The second piece is the graduation rate is considered an achievement indicator within ESSA, a required indicator. And those things all added together have to constitute over half of the formula. So I would imagine that by including the graduation rate in the strength of diploma, it helped get the percentage over that 50% mark. When you take into account the state wanted to have ACT in there as well. If I had to guess, those are the words. But the question becomes, do we think that an A should be a strong diploma, or a graduate, a 4-year graduate, they just graduated? Is that a strong diploma, or should we rename the index Or should we think differently about how we're allocating points?
Rename the index just diploma?
I don't know.
Is that what you're
It's kind of, that was kind of a modest proposal also. Because the question is that a strong
Is it
diploma?
strong?
Are you measuring the strength of the diploma, or are you, like, bases, everybody gets 100 that graduates?
That's basically it, AP, so
Yeah.
it's.
Those things, I think, are the strength of the diploma, right? Like,
Yeah.
how ready was the student? Did they do things afterward? That's right.
That's true, yeah.
If you go back a few slides where you showed the proficiency levels for high school students. So in each one of them, at least the high end, I guess the high end. Try to figure out how to say this. If you just graduated, then in each one of those high school classes, at least 50% of our kids are in basic or below basic. So you're awarding 100 points to a student that graduates on top, knowing that at least half of them are not at the basic.
Yes.
And when you're at basic, that means you're not proficient. So correct me if I'm wrong, but proficient means you're able to function at work, you're able to go to college, you're able to do these things. So if the goal is to be able to be career ready, you have to be able to read, you have to be able to take measurements, you have to be able to do all of these things. And that's basically what the mastery bar is, correct?
Yeah, so I'm going to help you a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. You're mixing basic, mastery, and
Yeah,
all those
that's
things
what-
together. You meant mastery when
Yeah.
you said basic earlier.
Sorry.
Yep, no, you're doing really well for off the cuff.
Yeah.
Like reaction to complicated charts. Yeah, and in order to graduate, you have to reach an approaching basic. That is the requirement to graduate.
So it doesn't have to be basic.
Correct.
Correct. So we are awarding 100 points for someone achieving approaching basic to graduate in 4 years.
In the index called the strength.
In the strength of diploma index.
And they can't read them.
No, they can't read they can't read right at the level of,
Yeah.
at grade level.
A grade, but at some point, in order for that person to be ready to get out and to have any sort of meaningful career, I don't know where you're at, but I don't know what an approaching basic level, is there a grade level equivalent of what you're able to read at if you're approaching basic when you graduate high school? Say you finish 12th grade and you're at approaching basic. Is that a 10th grade reading level, a 9th grade reading level?
But it also depends on, right, like, so how are those very same kids scoring on work keys, right? Because that's different, right?
that
Work
is.
keys is career.
But that's why you can award different points for work keys, where it's not as simple as this, but I'm, to Thomas's point, we're awarding 100 points for simply getting a diploma. My question then is, the focus, we're saying, is you need to be college or career ready. And if you're getting out and you're in an approaching basic for some of these students, I don't think that person's career ready. I have a very hard time saying that person's career ready and that we're doing any service to any kid by just essentially giving them out of the system. Like, that's not okay. And that's where I don't know the answer today. But to Thomas's point, I don't know if giving somebody, the most you can get is 160 points. I don't know giving somebody 100 points when they can get to a maximum of 160. So essentially giving them more than half of the points for simply getting a kid to approaching basic, I don't know if that's achieving the goal of having a person ready for college or career.
So the question is, and it certainly isn't creating like a motivation, right?
No.
There's limited room for motivation because you are telling them, if you just get the kid across the stage, we're going to give you 100 points in 2 indices. Actually, more in the
End
other
of the spectrum of approach and basic.
So, first of all, I feel like that argument was compelling, and I tend to agree with that, Mr. Mellinger, but I am curious, like, what is the devil's advocate argument for it? Because this is a complicated system and thought has gone, so can someone make an argument as to why that's such an important measure and why it's in the system currently?
I can't make an argument for the 100, I can make an argument for more than 0 in the
Okay.
transfer diploma.
And to be clear, I'm not saying give them 0. I'm asking about the 100 to what you're putting, that's what came to my mind.
Yeah,
You, 100%, we need to incentivize,
graduation.
because as Dr. Davis said, that person can go into our work keys, and look, you can score you can score silver, you can score gold, you can get a credential in someone that maybe isn't at the mastery level, and you can learn, you can continue to grow once you get out of high school. So I don't want to say give them 0, I'm just playing,
You're just saying 100.
the 100 to me seems, you're giving them more than half the points for just,
So the question really is about how much weight
yeah.
you're gonna put on
Yes.
each component,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And maybe
Right.
today,
I
to
just
your,
want to,
maybe,
know whether or not
maybe,
anyone around the table feels they can make a compelling argument as to why the weight is currently 100.
Not 100, but I can make a few compelling arguments around a variety, around
Yeah.
pieces of that. You definitely want to incentivize, right, the behavior of getting the student to graduation with something that helps them, right?
4 years, right?
In 4 years, right?
So
You
on time.
want that. I think that also, if we're just defending the index itself, right? There are right, the achievement level, right, that a student has is a combination of how well prepared were they when they got to the school, and how fast, particularly in high school, did they move the kid to proficiency. So a student arrives at approaching basic from their elementary school, moving a child to mastery in 2 years because they're done taking their English and math tests by the end of 10th grade, that would be very challenging, right? So making sure that young people have the right credentials, the right support, people that know the young person and their family making informed decisions around like, what does this young person want to do with the rest of their life, right? Like, do they want to work in a career field, or do they want to go to community college for a couple years and get the support that they need in order to be ready to go to college? Those decisions need to be made there, and I think that one of the powerful things about a strength of diploma index, if it's actually measuring strength, is it pushes adults to say, okay, we're going to support the student with achievement because assessment is measured, but we're also going to figure out with that young person, what career path do they want to be on? And right now, we are not motivating that type of thought because we are giving 100 points for that, would be my.
But maybe to your point too, Kira, you know, whenever, I don't know how history on it, but whenever that 100-point allocation for the diploma was put in place, I don't know how many years ago that was, but it seems to me like the bar is being raised a little higher today, right? There's a lot more conversation about dual enrollment,
Yeah.
you know, and things like that.
Yeah.
How can we add more value to the Jumpstart track or progression on that track?
Yeah.
So I think the paradigm has changed a little bit, and maybe that's why the 100 points was there initially, because the bar was at a different place.
I want to make a point. I found this statute, here I am to go again, a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it might be informative. I asked the officers about it, and Jim wanted me to check on it. Informative as we're planning for high school, and the statute says that annually the colleges and universities should provide a report to BESE regarding the performance of first-time freshmen at the college or university, and including remediation rates. I don't recall the board ever receiving that, and then it's to go to the level to be categorized by high school. So I'm thinking maybe we could, if that information is being given, we could see how they're doing,
That's good.
but I have never seen this
I wonder,
information.
I have to dig into that and look at it. We might be getting it through like the college persistence data. I'd have to dig into exactly where that comes from, Board of Regents, like what exactly.
It's
are we
supposed
looking
to,
But we would like it as a study group, I think
Yes.
it would be very useful.
and if nothing else, I do think if it is going to you, that the board needs to be getting that information. Because the board's supposed to get it, and then you all are supposed to send it to the legislature by parish school system. So I just don't recall seeing that. But I know things get lost, and this was instituted in 2000, but then it says annually. So I thought that might be very informative for
Thanks, Shane.
some type of future accountability, we could look at how they do actually do once they get there.
We do post on the website college persistence data by school, so that could be what that is. So let me dig into that some more. Work keys. The accountability system is rewarding about 1 in 4 top university diploma pathway students for their workplace preparedness, according to the Work Keys assessment. And Work Keys points are generally more generous than the ACT. And that is the end of my high school slides. And we kind of handled that as like discussion throughout, so.
Does anyone have any questions about the work keys slide?
I feel like y'all saw a lot of this
We did.
imaging. So I did not include a ton here.
Is that clear?
I mean, I'll just kind of, I have concerns about, the changes to the high school diploma thing that we saw in June around this, because as we keep saying here, incentive structures matter. And so if you change this, right, I mean, right now we're giving kids a 0 or a 17 on the ACT. And so that incentivizes principals to pursue a work key score for that child that will earn them more points, right? And so we're seeing that as problematic, but the reality is, right, there are not hard limits around the ACT. The ACT company itself says that a child who scores a 17 on the ACT and goes to college, about 30% of them will have a B average in college, right? So there is room, right, there are confidence intervals around that 18 being a measure of college readiness, right? And so for me, what you're gonna end up doing with this change is putting kids that, are gonna struggle to get that 18, you're gonna end up having principals try to encourage them to do a career in tech diploma when they're capable of doing university work, right? Because you have changed the incentive structure.
It doesn't have to be that though. Like, you could also, if that's the concern, right? Adults performing, doing things that we don't want them to do, which is hurt kids, then the answer is you take away the work keys completely from the formula and you don't create an option there, right? Like, if you literally say that this is where you have to get on the ACT, I'm not advocating for what that number is because I don't have that number off the top of my head, or I don't have an answer that I'm ready to say publicly. You could remove you could remove the thing that is incentivizing that bad behavior, which is one simple thing.
But then you're also saying that somehow though, if the ACT is supposed to be, it's a measure of career readiness, and then you get rid of work keys, but you're trying to say that career readiness is also valuable by not using work keys, right? Are you truly saying that we value the university pathway and the career and tech pathway equally? Right? Especially when you've got a 17 earning 0, and a 17 can get you TOPS Tech. So, I just think that, I get what you're saying, right? But are you, throwing out the baby with the bathwater to solve the one incentive structure?
Well, I think that I could say the exact same thing about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, because a group of adults are going to do something that is not good for children because of the incentive structure, like saying, okay, well, we shouldn't make this adjustment, is also kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, and just to throw this out there, I think that teachers often do what's best for kids regardless of our incentive structure. And so, there is, right, to some degree, this whole thing bothers me that we feel like that the entire accountability system has to be tweaked to make teachers do the right things in the classroom. And I have a fundamental problem with that. And I get it, but different words feel like it's, it's worth saying.
I would add that, in my personal experience, when you're looking at potentially hiring someone for an entry-level job position, coming out of high school, there are certain fundamental skills that you're looking for, and those skills have to come from somewhere, right? So you're either going to provide OJT after you hire them, or there's an expectation that they're going to get those skills prior to applying for the job, right? Where are they going to get them from? If they're coming right out of high school, the expectation is they're going to get them in high school. So So we should be incentivizing, well, we should be providing those opportunities, first of all. Then we should be incentivizing growth in those areas for people that are pursuing those career paths. And I think what I'm seeing here is, we had an earlier conversation about, an interest in placing equivalent value for similar progress on either career path, right?
We had talked earlier about to tweak the strength of diploma to add extra deliverable courses, extra AP credit, things like that. You could probably do it with work keys as well, where you get one certification, you get extra points. If you get two, you get this. Or if you get a lower score on the work keys with a welding certification, then you get a higher, or some, I don't know if it has to be an all or nothing.
You're saying some kind of like, in order to count work keys, it would have to be like a really, really strong credential the student receives,
Or
coupled with the work keys.
Or if a person gets platinum on work keys, great, you got platinum. Or if you get silver on work keys, then pair it with a credential. Something where it's not, I think Dr. Davis said where the argument is it's easier to get a higher score on the work keys. Well, okay, if you're going to acknowledge that, if you get a silver, which I think is where the drawback was, and hold up, require a
Better than the credential that's required for the Jumpstart pathway.
require
So they would get a higher
or something like that, to make sure, to Ms. Morris's point, that student is getting out with some marketable skill, where they can go and say, look, I've got a welding certificate, I've started on my journeyman for electrician, master plumber pathway, or something like that. That might be a way to not throw both of them out, not completely disregard the work keys, but at the same time, work to fix some of the problems that are, I say problems, where arguments against why a silver shouldn't be given some things.
Yeah, when we come back and look at simulations, we're going to do a bunch of engagement between this meeting and the next one. Among the engagement that we will do is around what do the credentials mean, right? Like, what does it mean to be a full apprenticeship? And how do we think about that in terms of like awarding points? What does it mean to earn dual enrollment credit? And how do we think about the points? And then we need to come back once we look at those simulations and go, what are the incentives that we're putting in there and how do we want to address them if we think they are the right things to do? And I think they're like two separate conversations. What's the right thing to do, and then how do you get to a place where you can do the right thing and there are not negative incentives involved?
I do have a question. At the Accountability Commission meeting, the last meeting, someone said something like the districts are sending their work key score as opposed to the ACT score. And I don't think that was the correct language. I don't think anyone's sending anything. I think you all are. Can you tell me how that works when that information gets drawn for the school performance score, and which one is, do y'all pick the higher, like how it works logistically? I think that might be helpful.
We receive the data straight from ACT. We do analysis. We also send schools rosters and say this was their highest ACT score, this was their highest work key score. There are cases where ACT didn't match the kid and the school says, I have the score report, and then we verify and adjust. So there are cases where scores are sent, it's reviewed, and then released. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and what grade levels, like, at what point, like, I'm sure people are
They take
taking
the
it.
test in 11th grade, and then 12th grade is where it actually is included in the score after they finish 12th grade.
And there's like a cutoff period for the last ACT.
Any other thoughts here?
So I think the question I have for the group is similar to the elementary study, is there any other data, like things you need to see or you want to ensure that Thomas is able to help produce that would help us in the high school now? And the one thing I'd like to put on the table is, there's a theory in like, I don't know, wide scale change management philosophy called like Chesterton's fence, which is like this notion that like, whenever you're trying to solve a big problem, you should, if you approach something, and let's use a fence as a metaphor, and you approach a fence, before you remove the fence, before you change the fence, you should ask why the fence is there, right? And there's usually really good thinking as to why the fence is there, even if what you ultimately want to do is remove it, right? The thing about, I'm curious, and because I have less familiarity with high school in general, I'm very curious about why 100 points are given for strength of diploma. It is in our collective institutional knowledge to have a better answer to that than the one we currently have today. And I think knowing that will help us understand whether or not that's something that, we have a theory we want to change it, but I think it's going to be really important to understand how, for example, that was done. So I think we need to dig into the cupboard and figure out who can represent that perspective, and either in the stakeholder engagement process, it's probably earned, don't want to put it on the spot, but we really do need to understand that, in my opinion. And there might be other things like that where Chesterton's fence applies, where it's like, we're going to go do something different. It's important to understand why it's there.
Do you have an immediate thought, Aaron?
There's zero pressure for you to be like,
That's all right. And again, this is just coming from me, but I think everyone understood that the goal is graduation. That's the ultimate place that we are trying to get all kids, is to be able to graduate, with something that signifies that they're ready to go out into the world. I think what makes it difficult is there is an assumption that when they receive that diploma, that sheet of paper actually does signify readiness,
Yeah.
proficiency, to say it differently. But when you go to that next level, the standard for getting a diploma is not mastery. As you discussed, it's far from it. And so on one hand, we're saying 100 points is indicative of where we want all students to go. It is, getting the diploma, but I think too often the next question is not being asked, or being overlooked, or maybe there's just confusion, that there's a perception that the two are the same, that a diploma means that the student is proficient. And I think what we learned here is
not necessarily.
that is not the same thing.
Okay.
Yep.
That is helpful, thank you.
And the question is, what is the objective measurable thing that we can say actually means the thing that is not easily gained or controlled by the individual or individuals who have the control over it, right? So ACT might not be a perfect assessment, but it is an assessment, right? It is objective, it is outside of the control, right? As long as there's no cheating that occurs, it's outside of the control of the result is that that the school receives for that student. So how do you get something that's objective and something that we can believe in,
Yeah.
just like the accountability system? And there are going to be moments where we have to decide, are there perverse incentives? How do we correct for them? How big is the incentive going to be that's going to make somebody do something that we don't want them to do? And make tough decisions around that. Any other discussion on high school? And then we're going to do an example of one other state's growth model, which is Florida. And just give people real quick, it's actually fairly simple. So they divide their achievement levels below proficiency into an upper and a lower.
Wait, might want to say something, why Florida? Why are we looking at Florida?
It's an interesting model. Florida is kind of celebrated as the origin of school letter grades. They have a lot of perspectives on accountability. They like clear accountability systems, all of those things. It's also very simple. Now, as we've talked about today, growth is not simple, right? And a lot of things sit in tension. And this doesn't solve everything. It, in fact, will sit in tension with this question of like, should all growth be valued equally?
Yeah.
But it's not BAM-based, it's just a straight up movement-based. So I just think it's helpful.
But it gets at our like simplicity principle, essentially. Okay.
So we divide each achievement level into two. schools earn points when a student moves from the lower to the upper part or from the upper to the next lower part of the achievement level. Once a student scores at proficiency or above, they receive credit as long as their scale score moves up. So once you reach proficiency, you don't have to keep moving incrementally into the next upper. You just have to keep your scale score going up by at least 1 point. And then the students remaining at the top level receive credit, period. As long as you're in level 5 advanced, you just stay there and it's fine because you're maintaining advanced proficiency. Then they weight students in the bottom 25% again, so that those students who are in the lower achievement levels are actually being included in the growth measure multiple times to account for the loss of points from not being at proficient.
So basically, you are putting more value on the lower grade scale.
Yes. And every school, it's the lowest 25% of students in the school. So if the school is mostly high achieving students, in the state, they might not have very many students who are in the bottom 25% of the state, depending on the geography. But in their school, everybody has a lower quarter, the bottom quarter of students that they are focused on moving, whether they are at unsatisfactory achievement, approaching basic, or in our case, basic.
Let's go with Dr. Davis's concern about the students at the top level. I think this says that once you reach that top level, you're kind of there. I guess it does take out the incentive to continue that growth at the top level.
Yep.
So talk about what you were. Okay.
It does. It also doesn't solve for all growth being equal because the lower bands of our scale scores are wider. So to move half an achievement level is harder the lower you are. So it doesn't do everything, but it is a step toward clarity. It is a step away from BAM. It is no negative growth is rewarded. It is those things, which are some values that I've heard espoused over time.
But if I read it correctly, it says that above level 3, that you receive credit, so there is some value that's recognized, you receive credit as long as your scale score increases. So if your scale score is increasing, you're growing, and so you are receiving some credit for growth. So you're still getting some marginal credit for marginal growth at the higher levels. It's just not double the weight that it is at lower levels.
But you're also not valuing all growth equally because the student that is at proficiency only has to grow 1, and you get credit, versus this student has to grow 10 or 15 to get credit. So it's all of these kind of,
The bottom line is you're putting more weight on the lower end of the scale, or you're putting more value there. That's the bottom line, right?
Yep.
But you're still giving some credit at the higher level, just not as much.
Yep.
And their level 3 would be the equivalent of mastery.
It's close. Florida's proficiency is like 8 and 8 scale score points different from our level of proficiency. So their level 3 is a little bit lower than ours, but it's less than a standard deviation. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's completely insignificant, but it's pretty small. We'll dig more into that as we go along, but that's part of the assessment, that's part of the assessment index question.
If we were looking at student A and B and applying this growth model, what would stand out to you? Those be distinctives from our current student A and B chart.
Student A would still have a farther journey to move than student B.
Yeah, that doesn't change in this.
That does not change.
It's plenty.
Would student A receive any points in this one?
Maybe.
You would have to know where.
Where they started, all that. Yeah.
Not necessarily though, basically. Maybe, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
The theory behind it remains a problem, which is, should all growth be valued equally?
That's right. That's still a question.
10 scale score points, should it be 10 scale score points equals 10 scale
That's
score
right.
points, or not?
Right.
Should
This
schools-
doesn't solve for that necessarily.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I'll just say, like, the students in the bottom 25% of each school are weighted double. Like, I just wonder if Florida's schools are as economically segregated as ours are, right? Because, you know, if part of the assumption is going to be that low-income children have the biggest barriers to educational attainment, so you have to pour resources on them to help them reach their full potential. This is still not going to value equally the work that's going on in schools that are working with the kids that are furthest behind, because you're only getting the bottom 25% are weighted double, and that's gonna look very different, you know, at a, you know, Parkview Elementary here in Baton Rouge compared to, you know, Greenbrier Elementary, right? I mean, that's just very.
It's an interesting, it's an interesting question of like, when we say bottom 25%, you like hit the nail on the head. Is it economic segregation? Should we, if we were to like borrow the Florida model and do something and make it Louisiana focused to work, maybe we do the bottom 25% or the achievement levels that don't earn points in the assessment index. So you are still focusing on the lowest achieving students, but schools that have more of them, if it's more than 25% of their students, they're still receiving credit for all of the students that are below proficiency. Could be one way to focus on it. But then you fall into this question of once they reach proficiency, there's not a whole lot of growth that's required. But I'm glad that you brought that up. Part of why we wanted to do this was to dig into like the nuance of it. Other thoughts on Florida?
How would you summarize how well this has worked before? Or not?
I think that it's hard, like, anytime you're saying this has worked in this state versus this works in this state.
Well, I would say how well it worked relative to what they were doing previously.
They've been doing it for a very long time.
Okay, so it's not something new.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But the correlation and causality, right, are like, they're just different, right? So is it the accountability system that caused Florida's massive improvement, or was it a series of other interventions that occurred with accountability just being one of them? I think that Florida would say that like, the things that we pointed out as like our values, I think Florida would say are pretty similar to their values. It's clear, it motivates adults to do the right thing, it's not easy to gain, it's straightforward. And I think they would say that if it measures the right things and it's straightforward, it should theoretically work. So clear, straightforward, and there's like no room for regression. Kids have to move forward, they can't move backward. And it's easy for educators to understand, are you in the lower half of the achievement band, or are you in the upper half? And did you move across and make progress toward the end goal?
And just because when I saw Florida, I asked why Florida, and so I printed out their NAEP scores for math and reading for 4th and 8th grade so that you can look at movement over time, like later. I mean, like, to your point though, I mean, this is correlation, not necessarily causation, but you can look and see the movement.
What does it say? What are the headlines?
I mean, so they have moved forward, right, but not necessarily like huge growth like we might have seen, you know, in Mississippi where we've been talking about with the science of reading, but there's been an upward trajectory. But again, like in some of them, it's not huge. Like if you look at their math in the 8th grade, there's been, I mean, you just have to look at it and interpret it, but it's NAEP, so you can compare across years. And, you know, and compare, the little map there shows that they're doing better than a lot of the other states. But what I would have to do is go back and look at 2003 and see were they also back in 2003 doing better than most states. But it's just their NAEP scans.
Thank you. And also, just because accountability isn't the reason why things got better, isn't a reason to use the thing. Because there are people that would say to you that accountability systems aren't designed to incentivize, they are just designed to tell you how things are going. So the question is an accountability system going to move student achievement? Maybe. I think that you can incentivize certain things. Is this going to do it? I don't know. I think there are other things that are attached to it. But one of the things that we've looked at together is you're not going to get improved student outcomes if you're giving points for negative. There's no incentive there to focus and move forward if you're giving points for negative. So this is super helpful. But it gets to this question of like, what is driving that change? Is an accountability change? And I think there are places like the strength of diploma where you can motivate and incent behavior. This definitely removes a lot of the incentive to not focus on particular students, not support certain students.
Teaching and learning.
Thank you, Thomas, for that. So we are shifting to stakeholder engagement as our final topic for today. And essentially, this is our best thinking, but we'd love for you to strengthen it. We know this is a priority of the boards, and we understand stakeholder engagement is going to be very important input to our collective thinking here. So, but I think we're at like 80% initial feedback. That's what would you agree with that?
So we would focus on educators through the superintendent's advisor council members would be our entry point. We also have educators on a variety of other groups, including the Accountability Commission, who we would engage. You can see that in bullet 3. We would also engage with the principal and teacher be your finalists to just talk to them about growth and accountability systems and what they're seeing in schools. Parents, we would offer a few focus groups where we would try to focus on having a mix of urban, suburban, and rural, a variety of income levels and different school performance levels, magnet schools, non-magnet schools. And then lastly, we would offer up to come and assist board members with organizing listening tours in their particular board districts to discuss accountability, what you wish to have there. That would be individual board member decision to do in their individual board member district. And I would gladly come and present on the accountability system alongside you and talk about accountability.
Can you walk us through logistics for how this would play out for each one of those groups? Give an example for how that communication would work between the two groups and how those meetings would transpire.
So each would look a little bit different. So with principals and teachers of the year, we would get on a Zoom together most likely because they're from all across the state. Me, possibly Dr. Brumley, possibly Ms. Orange Jones, and just talk, listen, ask a series of focused questions around accountability. I would take some time, digest this conversation around what are the things that I need to understand more of, to share with you all, and inform simulations. And then we'd come back, hopefully by April 1st, that's my goal, with what we've learned on these different listening opportunities.
So that speaks to number 1.
Yes.
About number 2.
Number 2 would be very similar. Those we might do actually in person in different areas of the state. We'd have to identify pockets. We might even, based off of which board members take us up on the offer to come and do a listening tour, we could then do them the same day. Since we'll already have some parents and education leaders and all of that present there. And then the Accountability Commission, we would do our normal Accountability Commission meeting.
What's between number 2 and number 4?
Number 4 is a board member listening opportunity, which everyone come. And 2 would be, we would identify specific parents that meet all of these different categories to try to check. We'll work with school districts, advocacy organizations to find the right mix of parents in order to get a good, valid, reliable sample.
Don't forget about charters.
I think it's a subcomponent of what we need is the drill down on active groups. Because under active groups is obviously the Accountability Commission, but like, let's say the Charter School Association hosts an event for their charters, we kind of that. Like, I think it's about figuring out what groups exist that we can potentially push into. And we can give you guys the full proposal and see if there's other names of groups that should be added.
And these are all going to be Zoom meetings or face-to-face or? There's a lot of conversation about who's meeting and who's going to have access and how, et cetera, So just like to get clarity on, going forward with each one of these proposals, what that would look like.
So I think with superintendent advisory council members, we might call individual people and ask them questions and see how things are going. I think that some of this is still to be determined as we work through the next month or so. I'm very anxious about what COVID's gonna look like over the course of the next 2 months following Mardi Gras. So who knows what this is going to actually play out like. So I don't wanna make too many commitments because I wanna get you the feedback by the time we come back for April. But this is the plan as it lays out, whether it's via Zoom or in person, it's kind of to be determined. But we know how to do listening opportunities via Zoom now, like, we've been doing it for a year and a half, how long have we been doing it? How long has this been?
2 years. Can you name the other, just 1 or 2 examples within the department where we've used a similar stakeholder engagement strategy to compile data?
I think that we've done, I don't know. I've only been at the department since July. I arrived on July.
Teaching and learning. Yeah. K2, right, so there is a track record of being able to do this pretty efficiently.
2 comments on it. One, making sure that SPED parents and groups are on this BESE. And then the other thing I'm wondering, y'all heard, like, I'm very interested in the perspectives of the people who are actually living our accountability system every day, which is our teachers. And so I wonder if there's a way to have an online comment, like similar to maybe the social studies standards kind of thing, where we open up and allow teachers who may not live near where we're doing a focus group, and allow them to weigh in on kind of the strengths and weaknesses of the accountability system as we see it. And then we have the ability to go and read it to see kind of, I feel like that's really important, and I've had lots of teachers reaching out to me about when they're going to be able to have a say.
I think that we could absolutely do that. I'm glad to hear you say, so we can sit down and read it, because I was just going, oh my goodness, we're going to have to code all of these answers and give you. Okay, we'll figure that out.
Having coded many an open-ended question in my day at the survey lab, that is not fun.
You're not volunteering?
Well, I might, but, if we really did want to do that in some kind of rough codes, I could do some of that.
Okay.
I think to that point though, like learning from the superintendent search, like we did end up with like almost 10,000 responses when on a survey, online survey, and it did require a lot to like synthesize that and then give it to board members in a way that they would know how to be a meaningful input. So it is worth us thinking about what synthesizing at least looks like of all of this, since board members are going to be in and out, how we might provide you with some kind of synopsis that would, if it's helpful. If you don't think that would be helpful, but I feel like there might have to be some kind of synthesis.
Well, what I can do is ask like if people in my department who do content analysis that's automated by a computer, right? And so it pulls out words and is able to look at, pro and con. So it's not just the word, it's what are the adjectives around the word. And so I can look and see if there's software readily available that I could run that using Stata or like a statistical tool and then give it to the group.
That'd be great.
And the rest of this, we provide a summary on already. Okay, so if we feel like we are in a good place on the purpose of the accountability system, kind of where the challenges are, I'm going to go back and rewatch this video, spend some time with it, and we'll come back with some simulations, and we'll begin working on this stakeholder engagement piece, and we'll meet again in early April.
I have one question. We talked about 3 through 8 in high school. We didn't talk about K through 2. Is this group going to speak to K through 2 accountability at all, or we wait for the department to come back with their recommendations on that? Where does that go?
We can bring K through 2 back at the next meeting. Once we've got good simulations around 3 through 12, I think that adding K through 2 in a simulation is going to create, it's going to be hard to compare this and this. So let's start with getting the thing that we already have in existence modeled, and how does it look different? And then once we've settled on that, let's talk about how do we weave in K through 2.
Okay, so bottom line, it's in scope.
It is in scope.
Something that we will work on. Okay.
It was part of the motion as well for this group to do that.
Sounds good.
Any other thoughts?
Are we, like, I know that there are lots of people, you know, some of them are in this room, right, who have very detailed ideas about what they think the changes to the accountability system should be. And I think that some of their opinions are the very reasons that we didn't pass anything in June. And so I am curious about whether or not there ought to be a way for them to give us their white papers, right? So that we can look like comprehensively at what they think and avoid kind of a derailing of progress at a later date because they feel like that their voices were not heard. I mean, that doesn't mean we have to agree with them and listen to them, right? But I would like to know what they are because I think that ultimately at the end of the day, at some point, we're gonna have to vote on something. And so knowing, you know, what some of these groups who have powerful influence over BESE members, like what they think and want might be helpful to know.
We're engaging with many folks. We're going to be engaging with the superintendents. Mr. Falk has reached out to us to talk about what it would look like to meet and go through the whole thing, kind of do a very similar exercise to what we've done with you.
I just think if it's under active groups, like, I think we need a list. I think you're referring to potentially like institutional groups or advocate groups. To me, I think we need to make sure that list is comprehensive, and I would imagine if we're doing our job in that setting, people would be putting forward their best ideas. Yeah. I don't want to overprivilege certain voices
No,
over
I agree
others, which
with
is
that.
why I just think it's like, let's get that list right and make sure there's equity and how we're actually meeting with people.
Okay. Thanks for coming.
Thank
Thank you.
you. All right.
Okay.